another YouTube.
Yeah, maybe this way.
Should we move yours above the Foucault one now?
Yeah, sure.
I read it about it.
It's gone all the way to the bottom.
Oh, bullshit. Stupid internet. There we go. Oh, that was the link. Sorry. You're right. I think it was the link. I wish. A bit more of the screen showing. Okay, so that started.
And then we just change it so we can just see the, yeah.
Okay.
Good morning. So we're up to part A, observing reason. So the section on reason. Obviously, the section on reason is quite long. So in this session, I'm going to be covering part A, that's looking at observing reason. And then next week, our final part of this series, we're going to look at part B and part C. So obviously, the most popular section of Phenomenology of Spirit is the section we did last week, the self-consciousness. The section on reason often isn't given as much attention, mostly because a lot of what Hegel is discussing, especially the science, is fairly outdated, and that makes it not as accessible, and also makes it appear to be irrelevant. My argument is going to be that it's definitely not irrelevant, and that the main argument of this section, especially observing reason, is, and what he sees as the error of observing reason, is one that we still see being made today, all the time. And so that's going to be my contentious claim. So I'm going to start, like I always do, by trying to distill the argument of the section into a few sentences. Obviously, that's very problematic. And obviously, it's with the caveat that that interpretation could be wrong. But nevertheless, as through our errors, we manage to get to the truth, I'll continue to do that practice anyway. So first of all, reason for Hegel is the certainty of consciousness that it is all reality. So in this section of reason, we've moved beyond the self-conscious or the consciousness. Last week it was the self-consciousness, feeling alienated by the world. In reason, the subject no longer finds itself alienated in the world. It starts to interact with the world in such a way that it makes it something that is graspable, something that it can understand. So the first section, consciousness, remember the argument of that section is that you can't understand the object without the subject being involved. That any time you try to formulate an objective knowledge that doesn't involve the subject, you're going to always come up against some subjective involvement. The argument of the second section was that if you try to understand yourself as a subject without reference to other subjects, you're going to fail. It's only in reference to other subjects that you can have some understanding of yourself as a subject. And in this section, we're now moving on to the project of consciousness, attempting to grasp the object as a subject-object relation, and it's also a communal effort. So at the level of reason, you now have a community of scientists. It's a communal practice attempting to grasp the nature of reality. So this in section 232 is his description of reason. So now that self-consciousness is reason, its hitherto negative relation to otherness turns around into a positive relation. Up till now, it has been concerned only with its independence and freedom, concerned to save and maintain itself for itself at the expense of the world or of its own actuality, both of which appeared to it as negative of its essence. That was that definition of self-consciousness as desire that we looked at last week. But as reason assured of itself, it is at peace with them and can endure them. For it is certain that it is itself reality, or that everything actual is none other than itself. Its thinking is itself directly actuality, and thus its relationship to the latter is that of idealism. Apprehending itself in this way, it is as if the world had for it only now come into being. Previously, it did not understand the world. It desired it and worked on it, withdrew from it into itself, and abolished it as an existence on its own account, and its own self qua consciousness, both as consciousness of the world as essence and as consciousness of its nothingness. In thus apprehending itself, after losing the grave of its truth, after the abolition of its actuality is itself abolished, and after the singleness of consciousness is for it in itself absolute essence, it discovers the world as its new world, which in its permanence holds an interest for it, which previously lay only in its transiency. For the existence of the world becomes for self-consciousness its own truth and presence. It is certain of experiencing only itself therein. So the move from the self-consciousness to this section on reason is that now when the consciousness looks upon the world, it finds itself. It finds the world in some way affirming its understanding, affirming its own existence, rather than something alien. So this gets us to what's the purpose of this reason section. So remember when we started the phenomenology of spirit, the whole point is that phenomenology of spirit is supposed to take us through these different stages of consciousness to an end point where reason is actually something that frees us from a form of alienated consciousness. So it would seem to be at this section of the book, we've achieved the end goal, because we've realized that I can't have an understanding of the object without a subject. I've realized I can't have an understanding of subjects without other subjects. So reason would then be, okay, well, now I'm interacting with reality. I realize reality, as I understand it, is going to be partly conditioned by me. And I realize that my own conditioning is going to be conditioned by other subjects. And in this state, I can now grasp the world in a way that I'm not going to feel alienated by it. So what is the error that reason makes? So my argument would be, the error that reason makes here is that it assumes that its structures or methods are something transcendental or ahistorical. It assumes that reason is something that's actually not worked through time and through history in the concrete world. And so in some ways determined a priori. So there's a certain blindness of reason in this section where it doesn't appreciate the origins of the own principles and methods by which it's seeing the world as something that is in a way agreeing with it or affirming it. So I would argue the point of this section as a whole, the reason section, is that what it misses is spirit. It misses the fact that, and remember, spirit being Hegel's word for just the way in which a self-consciousness is always interacting with other self-consciousnesses. Like it's another word for the way in which that mind is something externalized, something that's acted through in the world. So my argument would be that Hegel's point is that you can't understand reason, or you don't get reason right, if you don't realize that it's also part of a historical, social, cultural manifestation. It's part of spirit. And this is just a quote from Stewart, which I find quite helpful in clarifying this point. So Stewart says, one important point here is that any scientific claim that we make about the world necessarily presupposes a set of institutions and a community of researchers with agreed upon methods and theories, roughly in the Kuhnian paradigm. In other words, any scientific claim about the world is not so much a claim about some external other, but rather is more a claim about the scientific framework or paradigm within which one is working. The very concepts, to say nothing of the object models which science uses to understand nature, are historically immutable, since they are bound up with the network of meaning that forms any given scientific theory. Thus, it is an illusion to think that one can make an isolated individual claim about the world without relying on a larger structure of shared meaning which makes up scientific theory. And I would say, perhaps problematically, overly simplistically, that what it's missing is just spirit. It's missing that the way in which this historical understanding is itself shaped by, motivated by the spirit, those broader social cultural elements. So then, and then the problem more specifically with observing reason, and this is where I think the argument of this section is so relevant for today. It's not so much that observing reason gets things wrong, that its observations are inaccurate. What it gets wrong is that it thinks its explanations are totalizing explanations. It thinks that when it observes the world, that the knowledge that is going to form from those observations is just what's there, and that it's got a complete explanation of the world. So, observing reason again and again in this section it's got a problem. It's always got a tragic flaw. It's got this. There seems to be this certain pride and arrogance that in the way that it's grasping the world as a scientific community, it's got what's there. It's got this totalizing knowledge. And of course, that's what it gets wrong. And what it's missing, my argument here, is that such an attempt actually involves something like a performative contradiction. Because and this is where the section ends with phrenology. So ultimately what Hegel shows is that this attempt at observing reason, it ends up at an absurd point where on one hand, you have this scientific community saying we've cracked what makes a code by which we can predict human behavior. And so on one hand, they're asserting themselves as incredibly powerful, active self-consciousnesses developing knowledge in the world. And at the same time, their conclusion is that human beings are nothing but the way their skulls are shaped, which is an incredibly, I would say, it's a very humbling thesis. If human beings are just what they are by the shape of their skull, how on earth have they managed to develop the knowledge or have they actively been these self-consciousness who've gone out and grasped that knowledge? So the very conclusion seems to ignore the very means by which that knowledge has come about. And this contradiction is evident all the time in our current society. For instance, and it's not very hard to find examples of this. A few years ago, I became really fascinated with a dating service that matched people according to their DNA. And I looked into it a little bit. And the experiment it was based on was ridiculously problematic. I'll run you through it with the proviso. My memory may not be completely accurate. But the experiment, and I don't think I'm exaggerating though, but the experiment was basically they got a whole heap of T-shirts worn by men which hadn't been cleaned. So they had their masculine scent on the T-shirts that had been kept in bags. And then they got women to smell the bags. And then they got the women to rate whether the degree to which they liked the scents, right? Then they matched the DNA. And what they found was that if a woman liked the way that a man smelt, then their offspring would have a better immune system, right? So, and then based on this, there was a dating service that was like basically, you send in your DNA, we look at other people's DNA, we'll match it. The only scientifically based dating service that you can find. Like, don't let all those other irrelevant things get in the way. Let's just look at your DNA and we'll match things up that way. I don't know if that's all completely true or accurate, but the point is, even if it's not, we can imagine something like that happening, and that is like the error that you have in observing reason. But there's other examples as well. Like people say, love is just a chemical reaction. It's just certain chemicals in your brain. And while it's true that love does involve these certain chemicals in your brain, what is ridiculous is then to say, and now we've completely explained what love is. We have captured the phenomenon of love and we've exhaustively explained it because we've given you the chemicals that are in the brain that show you what love is. Or you can take the example of of, you know, cognitive scientists who will make claims like there's no such thing as a self, because when we look into the brain and we get a brain scan, there's just no self center. And if there was such a thing as a self, then we would find it somewhere in the brain. There's a language center, there's like a happiness center. You can see I know very little about brain science at this moment. But we don't see a self center. It must follow from that what we think of as a self must be something false, because it's not something that's grounded in something that we can observe. That's the basic error that Hegel is seeing is happening with observing reason. So it's not that its observations are inaccurate. It's that it's trying to get an ultimate satisfactory explanation of what is there, one that doesn't alienate self-consciousness. And in doing so, it's almost like directly contradicting itself, because if you accept that, I don't know, a human being is nothing but an object, then how on earth do you explain that the human being seeking to develop knowledge of what it is in the first place? An object doesn't do that. It's the same thing in like when you find arguments. This is a recent one, The Case Against Reality. This is a book I like to pull apart a lot. I forget who it's by though. Probably I'm not going to say nice things about it, so it's probably best if I don't say it. And but the argument of this book is basically that because of evolution, human beings are programmed to not see what's real. That's the basic argument. So the idea would be human beings are programmed to survive. Because we're programmed to survive, it means that in our evolutionary history, the way in which we perceive the world and understand the world is completely determined by these evolutionary forces, not by some sort of will towards the truth. Therefore, it follows that when we perceive the world and what we perceive about the world is always going to be false, and it's always going to be in the best interest of how we survive, rather than what's actually there. And of course, and here the contradiction in this argument is just really obvious. If it's the case, if you accept that premise, if it's the case that evolution has shaped our cognitive and perceptive faculties so that we are unable to perceive the truth, then how is it that you are able to claim that that has occurred accurately? How are you, in making that claim, somehow exempted from these very patterns that you're saying must be the case? So that simple contradiction is sort of for me, the whole argument of this section. That would be it that's my attempt at a one sentence explanation of this section. So the first part of this section, which I found quite difficult, and I am going to say, sorry, so this is a very long section, and there's no way I could present it in the way that I was presenting like self-consciousness or introduction, where it was able to sort of go through fairly detailed. So there'll be slides here that summarize 20 sections, and there's just no other way I can get through presented in the time frame. So we will be going through it at a fairly brisk pace. My aim is to give you my understanding of the overall argument, but there's definitely going to be details that I miss. There's actually always details I miss, obviously, but today's going to be worse in that respect than usual. So the first thing that Hegel does in this section is he contrasts his idea of reason with the transcendental idealism of Kant. And what he wants to, and here he repeats some arguments, which I'm not sure if he's repeating them, but these arguments that are very similar to ones he makes in the introduction. So he wants to point out that it's not the case that when you're dealing with reason, this reason is a sense where you have a subjective faculty that is then operating on a world that and that the reason is coming only from the subject. And so he just wants to differentiate his own reason from that Kantian idealism. And so he repeats two main arguments against it. So one is that this idealism that just asserts that the world is rational without being able to be grasped, that the world is rational without being able to be grasped rationally without supporting this claim. So it's based on pure assertion. And this is a famous line where he says that the Kantian categories coming out of nowhere is a disgrace to science, or here it's an outrage on science. So to pick up the plurality of categories again in some way or other as a welcome find, taking them from the various judgments and complacently accepting them so, is in fact to be regarded as an outrage on science. And of course, Hegel's going to see his project as improving on that, because his project is going to show where those categories come from, and that those categories come out of time and history and so on. They're not just popping out of nowhere as something that that a priori determining how we think. He doesn't think the categories are wrong. He just thinks saying that the categories are a thing that's only in human consciousness and that we just have to posit and accept it, not question where they come from, it's just not acceptable. And the reason it's not acceptable is just because it means that we can never get to, you have to accept that alienated view of the world, of knowledge. You'd have to accept that we can never understand the in itself. And Hegel wants to say that's just not what we mean by truth. When we talk about truth, we mean understanding the in itself. And furthermore, he'll want to have said that we do grasp the in itself, that there's not a necessary alienating relationship between the subject and the world. So a second critique is that transcendental idealism ultimately ends up in contradiction, as it claims that objective rational knowledge is actual knowledge. But of course, that objective rational knowledge is just not what we mean by knowledge. Because transcendental idealism is saying objective rational knowledge is always determined by, conditioned by the categories of the understanding, it's always a relative objective knowledge. And Hegel's point is just that that's just not what we mean by objective rational knowledge. It's not going to satisfy the self-consciousness that's seeking to know. So this idealism is involved in this contradiction because it asserts the abstract notion of reason to be the true. Consequently, reality directly comes to be for it a reality that is just as much not that of reason, while reason is at the same time supposed to be all of reality. So that's a contradiction there, where if you say that we're seeing things this way because it's conditioned by the categories, then at one point you're saying our understanding of reality has to be rational, and you're also saying, but the in itself is not rational. This reason remains a restless searching in its very searching declares that the satisfaction of finding is a sheer impossibility because it can't have access to the in itself. Actual reason, however, is not so inconsistent as that. On the contrary, being at first only the certainty that it is all reality, it is aware in this notion that qua certainty, qua I, it is not yet in truth reality, and it is impelled to raise its certainty to truth and to give filling to the empty mind. The point being there, I read that as he's referring back to the earlier sections to show that on this account now, the reason that he's talking about is actually coming out of this desire for self-consciousness, to assert itself and to find itself in the world, rather than just and that's what's actually happening as self-consciousness is attempting to grasp reason. It's not that you can't. So Hegel has not started with just this idea of here's an empty consciousness sort of sitting in nothing and it's got these categories in its head. He started with here's a consciousness, here's self-consciousness now that's based on desire, and now you get reason out of that. So for that reason, he's sort of claiming his idea of reason is going to be a step on from the transcendental ideal of reason. So now that he's shown what he means by reason, he's going to critique observing reason. So first stage, observing reason involves observing the natural world using experimental methods to discover the universal laws about nature. In reason, the subject is active in the way it seeks to understand the object. And the object, which once superseded the subject, is now, the object which was once doing all the superseding is now itself being superseded. And we'll just read this 240 together. So it is true that we now see this consciousness for which being means what is its own, revert to the standpoint of meaning and perceiving, but not in the sense that it is certain of what is merely other. Previously, its perception and experience of various aspects of the thing was something that only happened to consciousness. This is the first section, right? But here, consciousness makes its own observations and experiments, and you can see the difference. Now, reason, like the reason is being active in how it's getting its knowledge. It's not just sitting, it's not like in the consciousness section where it's almost like just sitting there and passively trying to grasp the object. Meaning and perceiving, which previously was superseded for us, are now superseded by and for consciousness itself. Reason sets to work to know the truth, to find in the form of a notion that which for meaning and perceiving is a thing. It seeks to possess in thinghood the consciousness only of itself. Reason now has therefore a universal interest in the world, because it is certain of its presence in the world, or that the world present to it is rational. It seeks its other, knowing that therein it possesses nothing else but itself. It seeks only its own infinitude. But then in section 241, he seems to argue that observing reason actually cannot satisfy itself. Because it can't satisfy itself because just grasping what's there is not its ultimate interest. Let's read this and pull it apart. So while at first is only dimly aware of its presence in the actual world, or only knows quite simply that this world is its own, it strides forward in this belief to a general appropriation of its own assured possessions and plants the symbol of its sovereignty on every height and in every depth. In other words, this observing reason goes out into the world and says, this is this plant, and that animal is this, and this is how this works. And it begins to assert the power of its knowledge to determine what's in the world. But this superficial it is mine is not its ultimate interest. The joy of this general appropriation finds still in its possession the alien other, which abstract reason does not contain within itself. Reason is dimly aware of itself as a profounder essence than the pure I is, and must demand that difference, that being in its manifold variety become its very own, that it behold itself as the actual world and find itself present as an outer shape and thing. But even if reason digs into the very entrails of things and opens up every vein in them so that it may gush forth to meet itself, it will not attain this joy. It must have completed itself inwardly before it can experience the consummation of itself. That's a difficult passage. This is how I read it. Just observing is not going to satisfy reason. What reason wants is to find itself not just in the world as a knower, but in the world as something that's helping create the world. So in other words, it's going to find itself in the world as only when it sees itself as spirit. And this tendency for observing reason is to try to find answers or try to find the satisfaction in just stating what is in the world without appreciating that that's not enough for self-consciousness. The I isn't just something that wants to sit back passively and understand what is. It's something that's involved in constantly creating that world. And an observing reason just doesn't take that into account. Yes, that's why I think it's not going to satisfy itself. So in section 243, I think he points out this contradiction. That consciousness thinks by apprehending the object intellectually, it discovers the objective truth, but is actually only finding itself, transforming them into notions. And that's what I was trying to point out earlier with that performative contradiction. It looks like on the surface, when I've asserted that human beings can only, are always going to see things deceptively because of evolution, it looks like I found a truth. But what I'm actually doing in my very performance of making that claim is also making the claim that, and also I as a self-consciousness am able to grasp this truth, which is something other than the content that I'm explaining, right? So reason, therefore, in its observational activity, approaches things in the belief that it truly apprehends them as sensuous things opposite to the I. But what it actually does contradicts this belief, for it apprehends them intellectually. It transforms their sensual being into notions, into just that kind of being, which is at the same time I. Hence transforms thought into the form of being, or being into the form of thought. It maintains, in fact, that it is only as notions that things have truth. Consciousness in this observational activity comes to know what things are, but we come to know what consciousness itself is. And the outcome of its movement will be that what consciousness is in itself will become explicit for it. And of course, I think the end of that movement, though, is not going to be till the end of this section on reason. Okay, so we start with the observation of nature. So the first stage of this consciousness is observing nature is not just concerned with perception or observation, yes, but deriving knowledge that is now applying, that's attempting to find the universal. So we're looking for a universal knowledge, something that could apply to all things for all times. It starts with a classificatory exercise, putting everything in nature into categories based on their universal or differentiable features. But there's a tension in this classification. Because in classifying an object, I identify its differentiate, what makes the object unique. But every organism is completely unique. So what differentiates the organism from the universal is also what makes it an organism. And so any move towards developing a universal account of a particular thing involves separating from the universal and so ignoring its differentiate. So the idea is that any time you have a classificatory system, it's always going to fail to capture the complexity of nature. So you can have a system, but the moment I say, I know what this animal is, it's a horse, and my classificatory system is now explaining what it is, that's always going to leave out other things that thing is. For instance, what makes that horse different from another horse? So observation, which kept them properly apart and believed that in them it had something firm and settled, sees principles overlapping one another, transitions and confusions developing. What it at first took to be absolutely separate, it sees combined with something else, and what it reckoned to be in combination, it sees apart and separate. So it is that observation which clings to passive, unbroken self-sameness of being, inevitably sees itself tormented just in its most general determinations of what are the differentiate of an animal or a plant, by instances which rob it of every determination, invalidate the universality to which it has risen, and reduce it to an observation and description which is devoid of thought. The point being that any classificatory system that you come up with is you're going to find instances of observable nature that just don't fit with it, which means the classificatory system fails, or which means that two different classificatory systems would be equally applicable. They both work the same. So now it moves on. Instead of just classifying nature, it's now going to try to uncover universal laws that govern these phenomena. And this, of course, is going to sound very similar to the force and understanding section. The difference, again, between force and understanding would be that force and understanding didn't have that community aspect. So force and understanding was not a description of a scientific community trying to find the truth. It was a description of a form of consciousness just attempting to understand what's there. And in terms of force and understanding is understanding what's there by seeing it as explained by another world that's behind the appearance of the world. So observing reason now comes to go, okay, instead of trying to classify things, we're going to find the universal laws that govern all phenomena. So we're going to find universal laws, and by doing particular experiments, we can make generalizations which will then help us explain what's there. Hegel now sort of repeats Hume's problem of induction. So there's a tension between experiment and law. So law is found based on experience and experiment, but it's just not possible for observation to prove that a law holds for all places or for all times or for all relevant objects. So Hume's problem of induction, I'll just explain it very quickly. If you're going to claim that you've made a scientific law based on observation, that seems to rely on the assumption that there's a uniformity of nature, that what occurs in the past will also occur in the future. How do we know, though, that there is a uniformity of nature? Can we prove that believing that nature is uniform and that what happened in the past will happen in the future is a correct belief? There's two ways you could do that. One, you say the uniformity of nature is just is something that one must believe. So it's logically necessary. Now, that path of proving the uniformity of nature seems to fail. Because to knock that down, all I have to think of, is it possible for me to imagine a world where all of a sudden, whereas yesterday something behaved in one way, tomorrow it behaves differently? And yes, I can imagine that. I can imagine that all of a sudden the law of gravity fails, everything just starts floating upwards. I can imagine that although atoms are behaving one way today, tomorrow they behave differently. There's nothing logically inconsistent in that. Now, if you can't prove something if you can't say, well, it's just necessarily true because of the way that in terms of form of thought. Your other option is to prove it empirically. So you say, well, I'm just going to say that in the past, what happens in the future is the case. I believe in the uniformity of nature, just because that's what's always happened when I've observed things in the past. Then you have this argument. It's something like, I believe that what happens in the past always happens in the future. Oh, but why do you believe that? Well, because in the past, what happens in the past has always happened in the future. And then you go, okay, but how do you know it will happen in the future? And you can only answer that question by saying, because what happens in the past always happens in the future. In other words, you can't make the argument without repeating the claim. And that means it's a circular argument. And circular arguments are not convincing. So Hume's point was that we believe in a uniformity of nature, but you can't rationally prove it. We use it to make these observations. We use it to make generalizations. We use it actually in our everyday life and when we do science. But the fact that we believe is just part of our human nature. It is not something that we can rationally justify. And that's just the point that Hegel sort of agrees with that. And he says, so really the best we can do is not to say that these laws of nature are definite, they're probable. It's likely that what happens in the past will happen in the future, but we just can't know for sure. Also, reducing descriptions of objects to natural law treats them as something inert, determinate, and fixed. And so he also sees this problem in terms of how it comes to treat everything as matter. And this is very clear, like when you look at physics, for instance, it has a purely theoretical model of how things interact. But matter then just becomes this empty, not really an existent thing. It's just this empty category that doesn't actually describe anything we observe. It's like the world of the material world under this model becomes completely devoid of any sensuous or like actual qualities. So matter, on the contrary, is not any, and so yeah. So the way that we're thinking of matter is just not what is actually there. So matter, on the contrary, is not an existent thing, but is being in the form of universal, in the form of a notion. It's a theoretical, something we grasp theoretically, rather than something we're actually interacting with in the world. So reason, which is still instinctive, makes this correct distinction without being aware that just by testing the law on all sensuous being, it gets rid of the merely sensuous being of the law. And when it interprets the moments of the law as matters, their essential nature has become for reason a universal, and as such is expressed as a non-sensuous thing of sense, as an incorporeal and yet objective being. So this path of trying to observe things in terms of law, again, just seems to miss so much of what's actually a part of what we're observing in the world. Again, I mean, the point would be, this doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that when physics reduces the world to these objective, has that concept of matter, that it just becomes a purely empty, formal feature of the world. That doesn't mean it doesn't have predictive power. It doesn't mean it's false. What it means is that it misses things. It's just not a total explanation. What you can't do is say, because I've explained using physics the way that because I've explained using physics the way particles work, I can now explain to you the phenomenon of love, or why Napoleon behaved the way he did. It's just that it's a form of description that's useful, but it's just never going to completely satisfy. It's not going to give you a type of knowledge that's going to satisfy self-consciousness search to find a reality that's not alienated from. So now we come to this. I don't understand why this. It moves to observing the organic nature. So consciousness now turns from examining the world just as something. So whereas in the laws of nature, you had this idea of there's not really a distinction between the organic or the inorganic. Now consciousness turns to observing, okay, I'm just going to look at observing organisms. So here we come up to biology. So whereas aspects of inorganic nature can only find their completeness in relation to other aspects of inorganic nature, the natural organism maintains its determinateness as it relates to others. So natural organisms seem to, they avoid the problem. They can't be reduced just to matter in the way that happens to the world when you approach it looking for laws and so on. And so by observing organisms, we're able to observe these things in the world that have some sort of teleology, some sort of aim that they're trying to achieve in the world. This approach, but we can basically see this as a move from physics to biology, though. So the first law of the organism, observing consciousness develops, is related to an environmental teleology. So at first it says, what I'm going to do is describe the features of the organism based on how these organisms have had to adapt to their environment. This teleology fails for two reasons. So first, its laws are too general, and so fail to distinguish between different types of organic entities. So for example, observing reason here might say, oh, look, the reason why fish are the way they are is because they evolved in water, or they came about in water. So we can explain what a fish is based on its environment and the inorganic features, organic features of its context. That fails just because any feature that you come up with is just not necessary. This is a point that Hegel returns to again and again. So much of what observing feature finds are just correlations. And correlations don't give you something that has to necessarily be the case. So for example, it may be the case that I can explain why fish have fins because fins are really useful for moving through water. That's fine. And there's a connection there. But there's other animals that are in water that don't have fins. So you can't say there's a necessary connection between waters and fins. There's a meaningful correlation, but it's just not an absolute explanation. So secondly, there's no necessary relationship between individual characteristics of animals and features of the environment. The other problem is that if you use the fins thing, that might help explain, or even if all the fish have fins, there'll still be differences between those fish. Why is this fish this color and this fish this color? Which can't be explained just by their environment. So again, it fails to be a total explanation. Now it moves to an inner teleology. And this is the section that begins to look at anatomy, and it really does rely on an outdated idea of biology. But we'll go through it. So it now wants to, instead of just explaining what an organism is based on its environment, it's going to try to explain what an organism is by the way in which it's arranged to perpetuate itself as an organism in the environment. So these are the universal features of all organisms, which are then called which is sort of how the organism separates and maintains itself from other organisms. So these three things in Hegel's time, and this was the actual science of his time, there were three systems they looked at. The nervous system, which is sensibility, that's your ability to perceive things like light and so on. Muscular, which is irritability, and reproduction, which is intestinal. So a few things. So the nervous system is just your ability to sense the world. They called the muscular irritable because it was I think it just refers to the way they're doing experiments. It's muscles are contracting when we poke them with things. So it shows you're irritable. I don't know. I just think it's funny when you say irritability today, we associate it with intestinal. Those two things go together. Whereas they go, no, irritability is just muscular. So just think of muscles contracting and so on. And reproduction is not sexual reproduction. It's the way in which an animal takes things into itself to reproduce itself in the world. Intestinal. So I'm not actually sure where actual reproductive organs fit into that thing. Yeah, but like I said, this is very outdated. So his point here is that, okay, again, looking at these properties doesn't actually help us explain, give us a satisfactory explanation of what makes the organism the organism. So first, he points out that sensibility and irritability actually can't be clearly distinguished. They seem to be essentially identical. And this was related to a theory at the time around which I don't understand, but it was something like the more that you increase the sensibility, the more that a creature has sensibility, the less it has irritability. So the more that a creature is a sensing creature, the less it's a muscular creature. So the two things were seen as being related. Again, there's a lack of examples there. I don't quite understand what that means, other than that Hegel thought they actually couldn't be clearly separated. That leaves you with reproduction, but the problem with reproduction is that it doesn't seem to have any necessary relation to sensibility or irritability, and then it means that all these properties are basically equally indifferent towards one another. What that means is that if you view an organism this way, you're actually able to view these three separate elements or two separate elements of irritability and sensibility taken to be the same thing, but they actually don't relate to each other. If they don't relate to each other, then you're not describing the organism as a whole. So the organism must become indeterminate because you're not being able to explain how it operates as a single thing. So observing reasons divided up the organism, but it isn't able to put it back together. And this leaves him to say why anatomy then fails to grasp the organism as a living truth, because it can only examine the various aspects of the organism in isolation. The truth of the organic entity is how these systems work together, not what they are in themselves. So as he says, since the being of the organism is essentially a universality or a reflection into itself, the being of its totality, like its moments, cannot exist in an anatomical system. On the contrary, the actual expression of the whole and the externalization of its moments are really found only as a movement, which runs its course through the various parts of the structure, a movement in which what is forcibly detached and fixed as an individual system essentially displays itself as a fluid movement. Consequently, the actual existence, as it is found by anatomy, must not be reckoned as its real being, but only that existence taken as a process in which alone the anatomical parts have meaning. So cutting open a frog and looking at its different systems won't help you understand the way that that frog is a separate organism and a definite organism in the world working to achieve its own goals in the world. You'll be able to understand aspects of it, and you'll be able to understand maybe how particular parts of it work, but you won't understand it as an individual which is fluid in the way that it's moving through the world and interacting with the world. He now moves on to say, okay, then let's forget about trying to work out things from the inner properties. Let's look at the outer properties of things. And when you do this, what you're trying to do is just describe the organisms purely on what you can observe in the organisms. Things like its shape, its size, and its color. So you just rely on what's empirically observable. Forget about trying to grasp how the organism is functioning as something that's, that sort of has an inner world that's manifesting in the world. But again, this founders on the relation between the inner and the outer. So saying that what differentiates an organism is just its outer features is just to say that there is no relation between the inner and outer. But if you're saying that, then you're basically treating an organic being as the same as an inorganic being, and it's just not the case that that's what an organic being is. An organism is different from an inorganic organism. So just describing it according to those purely empirical characteristics is not going to give you an adequate explanation of the organism. So, but to consider the shape of the organism as such and the inner qua inner merely of the shape is in fact no longer to consider organic being. For the two aspects which were supposed to be related are posited as merely indifferent towards each other, with the result that the reflection into itself which constitutes the essence of the organism is done away with. What really happens here is the attempted comparison of inner and outer is transferred to inorganic nature. Now he moves to the last section. So his reason's gone from inorganic, so I'm just trying to understand the world as it is, classification, natural law. Okay, that didn't work. Let's focus on biology. I'm going to try to describe the organisms, what makes an organism work. So it's gone to the organic, and now that's failed as well. So now it moves on to bushing the two together and says, right, let's just bring the two together and try to see how the inorganic and the organic as some sort of totality. And then he talks about three different aspects here, which I'm going to go through very quickly. So the first is gravity and cohesion. So he imagines gravity is this inner that relates all the other attributes or outer attributes. But the problem is here is again that gravity just does not account for all the differences between the objects. So you might say, you can take, say, three objects, put them side by side, and measuring their weight and so on, you can predict the way in which gravity is going to make them behave, but that is just not going to capture all the differences between those objects, like their qualitative differences. Genus and species. So now observing consciousness tries to conceive the world in terms of genus and species as a massive structure where everything sort of has its place. But you have the same problem that you have in the classification and the same problem that you had when you had with the biology. And that's just that the living individual, in virtue of its inner being, takes no account of its determinateness as a species. So an actual dog in the way that it lives in the world and reinforces its existence in the world. It just doesn't care that it's a dog. It's not one of its concerns. So this, and this idea that you can sort of put everything into this one big system fails on that account. And next, consciousness comes to see Earth as a single organic entity. So, and this was apparently an idea that Hegel really had a lot of time for in his earlier writings. And this would be seeing the Earth as a totality that would allow us to explain the behavior of every organic and inorganic entity. So in other words, you could say, I'm going to just see the world as one organism with one end, and everything that's acting in that Earth, organic or inorganic, is related to that totality. But again, this does not allow us to explain, just doesn't allow us to explain the behavior of particular individuals that are indifferent to one another on the Earth. So why observing reason ultimately fails? So as we've gone through these many different attempts of observing reason to grasp the truth of what's there, to see the world using its own activity, to find itself in the world, what it does again and again is it makes generalizations and it makes correlations, but it just fails to unite individuality and universality. The laws of living organisms are just too ad hoc and empty to have any real explanatory value, or at least to have any ultimate explanatory value as in exhaustively explaining what is in the world. So it follows from this that in existence, in its structured shape, observation can encounter reason only as life in general, which, however, in its differentiating process does not actually possess any rational ordering and arrangement of parts, and is not an immanently grounded system of things. So what is observing reason missing here? So it seems that observing reason just overreaches in its desire to have everything be external, objective, and asubjective in a way, even though it's aware of its own subjective efforts in creating that knowledge. It does not allow for there being rational structures or entities that have causal efficacy that are just not empirically verifiable. There are just things that we observe in the world that are not going to fit into, that are just not things that we can observe empirically, and that are not going to fit into a system that's based on the idea that there's a single world that is there as part of like an unceasing existence that's not somehow dynamic and always changing. So what observing reason forgets is that there are things that have causal efficacy in the world that you're just not going to fit into any observational system. Another example of this, by the way, I think of is like, you know, Dawkins' idea of, is it means? Yeah. And the idea that you can explain religion as almost like diseases of the mind. Again, it's an attempt to take something that just isn't, that is try to give you this almost like purely empirical explanation of how ideas spread and why people would believe things that, at least from Dawkins' perspective, are completely rational. But that sort of theory just doesn't help explain why someone makes a particular decision. It just doesn't explain why, you know, at a particular point in time, Caesar did choose to cross the Rubicon. Those decisions were made. You can talk about there's just so many conditions, so much complexity around why things actually happen that we can't just reduce it to something that we can put into a system that we've empirically verified. And science forgets that it actually relies on both of these to function. So, and as this becomes very clear at the end of the next section. So it itself is an outworking of substance, and so reliant on the existence of things like intentions, desires, foundational beliefs, which just aren't empirically observable. And they're not going to fit into any of the systems that observing reason creates when it tries to look at the world and fit it into a single account of what it is there. So, and we're going to see a similar problem arises when observing reason attempts to observe its own self-consciousness. And we'll start that section at 11 o'clock. Okay. So psychology section is one of my favorite sections in the whole book. And so I find the argument in that section fascinating. I still think it's very relevant as well. I don't have a lot of faith in psychology. So we'll run through that. And it's also a really small section. And then the section on phrenology and physiognomy is unique insofar as Hegel definitely makes jokes. There's at least two. In the section, there's about 2 jokes in there where he's actually being funny. Yeah, it's as funny as Hegel as a phenomenology screw gets. Okay, so now self-consciousness turns to try to understand itself. The first attempt it makes is actually understanding itself through the laws of thought. So here Hegel makes the point that these laws are not formal rules that apply only to human thinking, but rather intrinsically universal and therefore apply to all being. And this, of course, is what he's going to develop when it comes to the science of logic and so on. So his problem here is not that the laws of logic are, again, wrong. It's that what he doesn't like is the fact that here self-consciousness treats them as something that's being found, as something that they've just found appearing in the world, and is not thinking about why they are the way that they are. So by describing them and as like laws of logic, it turns them into a content, and so removes them of things and so it implies that they're not actually these forms of thought that are active in developing knowledge. So this is the quote from section 300. In point of fact, these laws are not the truth of thought, not because they are supposed to be merely formal and to possess no content, but rather for the opposite reason, that they are supposed in their determinateness or just as a content from which form has been removed to rank as something absolute. In their truth, as vanishing moments in the unity of thought, they would have to be taken as a knowing or as a movement of thought, but not as laws of being. But observing is not knowing itself and is ignorant of it. It converts its own nature into the form of being. It grasps its negativity only as laws of knowing. So his issue there with logic is just that by treating these things as, we found these laws of thought, what you take away is the fact that these are dynamic, active processes always occurring in the world. They're not something that you can take out and separate from that activity as some form of content and say, look, we found these immutable things that exist outside of history and so on. So that's pretty straightforward. Now let's go to interesting stuff. Okay, psychology. Psychology involves looking at the behavior of the consciousness in actuality. So human behavior, Hegel says, involves 2 things. We act in accordance with the habits, customs, and conventions of their culture. So we're constantly acting basically in accordance to how we're brought up, which I just thought of the Heideggerian idea of the they. Like we're one of the they, right? But also we distinguish ourselves from those conventions. We negate the universal. We act in ways that separate us. So an example of that is that all of us have, all of us value education because we're all here learning, but we're also distinguishing ourselves from everyday people because we've decided to study Hegel. And that is not that's not like a dominant thing that occurs in our culture, and in Brisbane anyway. Yeah. So this means you're finding a law in psychology that explains the individuality in relation to universal circumstances, inorganic nature, such as situations, circumstances, habit, custom. But individuals relate to culture by distinguishing themselves from it. So yes, every individual is determined by a number of factors, but the individual is always involved in choosing how it determines them. And the argument here is just going to be, psychology is going to try to find patterns for explaining human behavior by relating certain behaviors to the inorganic, to explanations that are things like habit or custom or circumstances, some form of objective features. But just because of the nature of what individuality is, those explanations are always going to fail. So therefore, section 306, what is to have an influence on individuality and what kind of influence it is to have, which really mean the same thing, depends solely on the individuality itself. To say that by such and such an influence, this individuality has become this specific individuality means nothing else than it has been this all along. Circumstances, situations, customs, etc., which on the one hand is shown as already there, and on the other hand is present in this specific individuality, express only the indeterminate nature of the individuality, which is not the point under consideration. If these circumstances, way of thinking, customs in general, the state of the world had not been, then of course the individual would not have become what he is. For all these elements present in this state of the world are this universal substance. The fact, however, that the state of the world has particularized itself in this particular individual, and it is such an individual that is to be comprehended, implies that it must also have particularized itself on its account and have operated on an individual in this specific manner, which it has given itself. Okay, I'm going to try and unpack what he's saying here. So let's say we make the claim. The way that this individual behaves is determined by its circumstances, which is what a law of psychology would aim to be. The problem is every single individual is different, right? In the way in which it's relating to its circumstances. So if I'm going to make the claim, well, the individual, the circumstances have determined this individual, I also seem to have to make the claim that these circumstances are constantly making everyone different, because that was also something I always see in the world. So if I was going to be honest about saying I want to draw a distinction between the relationship between circumstances and context and make a law about how that's going to make individuals behave, if I was honest about it, wouldn't I also be saying that, yes, but what I actually observe is that the way, the circumstances and everything just don't absolutely determine the way that individuals are going to behave, because it produces all different individuals that we don't have, so that we aren't able to predict their behavior. Since on this account of this freedom, the actual world is capable of having this twofold meaning, the world of the individual is to be comprehended only from the individual himself, and the influence on the individual of the actual world, conceived as existing in and for itself, receives through the individual the absolutely opposite significance, viz., that the individual either allows free play to the stream of the actual world flowing in upon it, or else breaks it off and transforms it. The result of this, however, is that psychological necessity becomes an empty phrase, so empty that there exists the absolute possibility that what is supposed to have had this influence could just as well have not have had it. So if you define psychology as trying to give you laws to explain how individuals behave based on external factors, whether that's brain states or cultural influences or anything like that, it's always going to fail because it's not actually treating that individual as an individual. What it means to be an individual is that you choose how those circumstances are influencing your behavior. Okay. So let's look at something. Let's think of some examples of this. Unpack it a little bit. Here's an example of a psychological law, which I heard once in a lecture. And I think the person was actually arguing we should put up, if you just put cameras everywhere, you stop theft. It's a basic argument, I think. So here's an example of psychological law. We've done studies. It shows that if human beings feel like they're being watched, they're less likely to do the wrong thing. I think the experiment she was talking about, it was like cookies that were left in a staff room, and they had like one case where they were just left there, and there was nothing watching them. Well, I guess there was some watching them, like psychologists, wherever they were. And then there was like another instance where there was like they put up a sign you're being watched, and then another instance where they had like a cardboard cutout of someone standing next to it, and they just measured the degree in which people stole the cookies. Right? Okay. So you make this, and you say, look, we've basically found this psychological law that human beings, if they're being observed by someone, are less likely to steal. You've made a generalization between external circumstances and individual behavior. But first of all, such a connection cannot show why human beings have acted in that way at all. It's really only asserting a correlation. Again, it's not explaining the causation. Secondly, it just doesn't explain all the people who don't act that way. Like in any psychological experiment you do, there are people who don't do what most people do. So how are you explaining what those people have done and why they've done it? And once you take into account the fact that, and so in a way, what every psychological experiment shows you is that it's not possible to predict with absolute certainty what human beings are going to do based on their external circumstances. The best you can do is establish some correlations. And again, you're working with probability, but it's just probability that's even worse than it was when we were talking about natural law, right? for psychology to function, in other words, it treats human beings as if they're objects, and that's just not what they are as individuals. And this really fits in with, there's a really good book called The Hidden Half, which is all about the replication crisis in science, how the way that the scientific community is now set up. I might just quickly explain it. So it was I think it was an Australian chemist. He wanted to, there was a particular finding in a chemistry, an article in a chemistry journal. He needed it for commercial purposes. So he attempted to replicate it in his lab. He wasn't able to replicate it. He went to the people who published the study and tried to replicate it with the people who published the study in their own laboratory, in their own place. They still couldn't replicate it. So he basically had a study published in a scientific paper which couldn't be replicated. And it's chemistry. And then he went on and sort of did a bit of a deep dive and looked into other, began to just look at other published papers and again tried to replicate the findings. And look, long story short, what he found was about 90% of cases they just couldn't be replicated. Not just replicated by him, but could be replicated by the people who were publishing in the first place. And his point is that no one's being dishonest here. It's just that the way that science as an institution is set up, you only publish if you've got something original. Scientists who no one publishes replication studies. That's just boring, or at least it's not going to get you any. It's not going to get you any status, notoriety, and people are so desperate for their hypotheses to work out to be true. There's going to be human bias is going to creep in. Now that problem applies about 20-fold when you apply to psychology. If you try to replicate an psychology experiment that worked in California and Berkeley, and not only and of course one of the big problems of psychology is that generally speaking, all these experiments are being done on university students. So you've got a big problem with even just like the group of people who you're pulling out to do these experiments on. Yes. So that's yeah. So if we're having trouble with our science of like replicating chemistry papers, it means that when we're talking about psychology, I even think the replication crisis would mean it's even less. We should even be giving that even less credence. Another problem with such laws. Here's an example of this idea though that the inorganic can influence decisions but doesn't determine them. And Hegel, of course, is saying that of course your circumstances determine what you do. They're always a necessary condition of what you do, but they're just never a sufficient condition. They never completely explain it. So, of course, you take that into account. Of course, they're relevant, but they're not going to give you an absolute final explanation as to why people behave the way they do. So, for example, let's say someone is bullied at school, and as a result, they turn into a bully themselves. So you have an external circumstance and you have a behavior. So a psychologist could easily say, well, I know why this person turned into a bully. They were bullied themselves, and when people are bullied, they're likely to bully. I've got an explanation as to why they bullied. But you can have exactly the same circumstances lead to the exact opposite case. Someone is bullied. As a result, they come to hate cruelty, and they become a great champion against bullies, or become someone who is super compassionate towards people. The same circumstances lead to completely different outcomes. So Hegel's point is that you just can't explain. Individuals always are determined by, relating to their circumstances, but they just never completely determine what the individual does. If you want to claim they do, then you're just not treating this thing as an individual. An individual, by definition, is how it relates to its circumstances, whether it allows those circumstances to completely determine it and just go along with everything, or whether it resists them. This is also why, when you do psychology experiments, like here's a famous psychology experiment. Like they have, I like this one actually. It's like they line everyone up, and then they have like 15 actors, and there's one person who's being experimented on, and they show them a picture that has 3 people in it, and they say, how many people are in this picture? And everyone down the line says 4, lying. And then it comes to the last person, and they just want to see what they say. Are they going to say 4 and go with everyone else, or are they going to say 3, just asserting what they actually are saying? And they go, oh, well, 80% of people say 4. Therefore, we've shown that there's a psychological tendency for people to agree with what everyone else, whatever everyone else is doing. Again, though, but if you said to this person, oh, we're doing an experiment on you where this is what's going to happen, what are they going to do? They're going to purposely go, well, I'm going to ignore everyone else then and say it's 3. So you may find a general, so what psychologists could do is find these general correlations. Oh, look, in the situation where everyone's doing this, it's more likely that a human being to agree with them than disagree with them. Fine, but you're not explaining, that does not explain what an individual will actually do in a particular circumstance. It just doesn't give you that explanation. You've found a general correlation. You haven't found a law of nature because human beings are not objects. Okay. Also, furthermore, the other thing to keep in mind is just when you tell someone they have a this is the other thing that psychology doesn't take into account. I think this is more my side. If you tell someone they have a particular psychological condition and it changes their perception of themselves, that itself is then going to change the way in which they choose to behave in relate to their individuality. So again, the very fact that the very effects that psychology have shows that idea that human beings are just objects who are just determined by these purely external circumstances just isn't the case. For example, if you tell someone that there's no such thing as free will, that person could feel, well, since my decisions are not my own, I'm just going to do whatever I want and go out and do horrible things and get into trouble. And my claim is going to be, it wasn't really me. It was just these external circumstances acting through me. And of course, but when we hear that example, we just go, yeah, but that's just obviously false. You're just pretending like you are going to be completely determined by your circumstances. And that's just not the case. That's not what an individual is. So you can't appeal to psychology or some psychological principle and say, this is my explanation, my complete explanation for why I did what I did. We just wouldn't accept that as self-conscious creatures. Okay, that's psychology. Now we move on to physiognomy and phrenology. Now these disciplines don't exist anymore. They were making a comeback in Hegel's time. So they were real things that people actually believed and practiced in Hegel's time. So physiognomy were both movements that attempted to determine human characteristics based on physical features. So physiognomy was the body and especially the face. For phrenology, it was the skull. And both of these sciences are the same in that they attempted to explain the inner based on something external. The basic principles of behavioral psychology would later attempt to do the same thing, though. The idea that all we have are what we can observe. And so that if you just show me what people are actually doing, the behaviors I can measure and observe, I can have some, I can have some idea of what's happening on the inside by looking at the external features. Okay. So these create a division between the individual as for itself or as a determinate being, and those aspects of the individual that are observable and which express the truth of the inner individual. So the difference is the individual is for itself, which is the individual as it's trying to act intentionally in the world, versus its determinate being, which would be features of its body or its skull over which it doesn't have direct control. So this being, the body of the specific individuality, is the latter's original aspect, that aspect in the making of which it has not itself played a part. But since the individual is at the same time only what he has done, his body is also the expression of himself which he has himself produced. It is at the same time a sign which has not remained an immediate fact, but something through which the individual only makes known what he really is when he set his original nature to work. So the idea wasn't just that you were born, wasn't that your body was just determined by your DNA, which is what we think today, although that's actually a very problematic assumption as well. What the idea was that if I'm an evil person, I'm going to scowl all the time, so that scowling becomes almost like a permanent feature of my face. And so then by looking at my face, you can tell whether I'm a bad person. That would be the idea. That in a way, the way we act in the world produces changes in our bodies, which are then able to be used to explain what our inner world is like, or the truth of who we are. So the first version of physiognomy sees the true nature of the individual as being determined by the individual's actions and the organs they use to affect those actions. So things like it could be features of the body, hands, things like that. This fails for two reasons for Hegel. So first, direct expressions of inner states fail. So first, even when I try to tell you what my inner state is, I fail at this. And this part of this section is really close to Lacan, like in terms of how he describes what speech is. He says that when I try to explain what's really happening in my inner life, even directly, my speech and actions don't match external reality. So even if you take an instance of someone saying, just tell me what's inside you right now. What do you really want right now? My speech, as Hegel very perceptively says, it's like, well, it either says too much or too little. It never quite captures or measures up to the inner. So even in conscious attempts to express my inner, I fail. It's actually really difficult. And second, the more obvious point, actions can be deceitful. People can intentionally act in a particular way to hide what their true self is. And you can imagine if you had a discipline of physiognomy becoming very popular, and it had a rule like all criminals have, I don't know what it will be, all criminals have large eyebrows or something like this. It'd be a ridiculous rule. The criminals could just go shave their eyebrows off, right? Like you could, whatever the rule is, you just go, okay, well, now everyone's going to think that's the rule. I'll make sure I change it. So I take advantage of what everyone is, how everyone is reading my external science to tell them about the inner. So not only do the results of the actions through this externality of the influences of others lose the character of being something constant in face of other individualities, but since in their relationship to the inner, which they contain, they behave as a separated, indifferent externality. They can, qua inner, through the individual himself, be something other than they appear to be. So either the individual intentionally makes them appear to be other than what they are in the truth, or else he is too clumsy. Oh, sorry. So if they can do it intentionally, but then he says here, on the other hand, someone might just be really bad at enlightening. So they're trying to express themselves in one way, but they just fail miserably. In which case, again, we're getting a very bad reading of what's actually happening on the inner. He's too clumsy to give himself the outer aspect he really wanted and to establish it so firmly that his work cannot be misconstrued by others. The action then as a completed work has the double and opposite meaning of being either the inner individuality and not his expression, or qua external, a reality free from the inner, a reality which is something quite different from the inner. So when we're looking at anyone's action, it has this double opposite meaning of either being the inner, so of like almost like a failed attempt to express the inner, or a successful attempt to deceitfully display the inner. Either way, it's not going to get you the truth. So physiognomy now turns to something that cannot be faked. And here it now becomes purely physical attributes. So body, size, shape, facial characteristics, they come to be seen as mediating. And now the human individual is divided into two aspects. This true inner nature and its externalization through the middle term, what Hegel calls the middle term of the body. The inner is seen as the permanent or essential aspect of individuality, character, intention, and the actualization is the inessential. The body or the face is seen as making the visible, makes the invisible visible. Okay. And this comes to the main issue of physiognomy, that the relation between the inner reality and the bodily feature is contingent. So there's just nothing necessary about the relation between the sign and what it signifies. And this is a point he's made again and again in this section. Observing reason has found a correlation. It hasn't found a necessary cause and a necessary relation, and it hasn't found a causal relation. So it is therefore indeed an expression, but at the same time only in the sense of a sign, so that the particular way in which the content is expressed is a matter of complete indifference so far as the content itself is concerned. And this appearance, the inner is no doubt a visible invisible, but it is not tied to this appearance. It can be manifested just as well in another way, just as another inner can be manifested in the same appearance. And one of his jokes, Lichtenberg, therefore rightly says, suppose the physiognomist ever did take the measure of a man, it would only require a courageous resolve on the part of the man to make himself incomprehensible again for 1,000 years. And that was a point I made earlier. If whatever law a physiognomist came up with, once you told someone that law, they could use it to prove you wrong by just changing their features, or by acting in the complete opposite way to which their features are supposed to mean that they act. So the laws which this science sets out to find are relations between these two supposed aspects, and hence can themselves be nothing more than empty subjective opinions. Also, Since the object of this supposed way of knowing, which takes it upon itself to deal with the reality of spirit, is just a reflection of spirit out of its sensuous existence back into itself, and a particular physical existence is for spirit something indifferent and contingent, this kind of knowing must be directly aware that the laws it has discovered tell us nothing. That strictly speaking, it is idle chatter or merely voicing one's own opinion, an expression which contains the truth about itself, viz. That is one's own opinion that is put forward, hence not the matter itself, but merely the opinion of one's own. As regards their content, however, these observations are on a par with these. It always rains when we have our annual fair, says the dealer, and every time too, says the housewife, when I'm drying my washing. The point being here is that if you're going to have a statement like criminals, I used the example earlier, criminals have bushy eyebrows. There is nothing about being a criminal that has a necessary relationship with bushy eyebrows. So what you've found is a correlation that generally when I see a criminal, they have bushy eyebrows. And sort of at the height of this, remember we were talking about this yesterday, Joel, and you gave the example of they like got all the criminals. Yeah, and they like took photos of them all and just tried to find what's the similar facial features that these criminals all have. And they said this is the criminal face. Yeah. So Hegel's point is just what you have found is nothing but correlation. All you've said is that these features generally when someone has these features, they tend to be a criminal. But that's no more convincing. You haven't got a causal explanation. But why does that feature relate to it? All you've got is a correlation. And a correlation just doesn't give you any satisfactory explanation as to why it is the case. So it's no better than saying, oh, look, whenever the annual fair is on, it rains. It's just a correlation. When obviously there's no causal relationship between the weather and the date that you're seeing the annual fair. Or maybe there is a little correlation, but definitely nothing necessary. And then so he shares this joke from, this is the joke, one of the jokes, so Lichtenberg, who characterizes a physiognomic observation in this way, also says this: if anyone said, you certainly act like an honest man, but I see from your face that you are forcing yourself to do so and are a rogue at heart, without a doubt, every honest fellow to the end of time, when thus addressed, would retort with a box on the ear. This retort is to the point because it refuses the primary assumption of such a science of mere subjective opinion, viz. That the reality of a man is his face. But the true being of man is rather his deed. In this, the individual is actual and is the deed that does away with both aspects of what is merely meant to be, and the one aspect where what is meant has a form of a corporeal passive being, the individuality in the deed exhibits itself rather as a negative essence, which only is insofar as it supersedes mere being. So the point here is that if someone came up to you and said, look, I'm a physiognomist, I can tell from your facial features that you are actually a terrible, cruel person and you enjoy torturing kittens or something. And you respond to it's like, but I've never done that. It's like, yeah, but you want to. I know, because your facial features. It's like a legitimate response to that person would be to just hit them. That would be your your rejoinder. Your witty rejoinder would be to box them over the ear. Because the point being, that's just incredibly offensive. How can you judge someone other than by what they've actually done in the world? The way in which we show our inner is actually through deeds in the world, and it's not not what we think we are, not our secrets of what we've hidden away, not our secret desires. It's what we actually do that determines how we should be judged by others, and definitely not just our features. So now he moves on to phrenology. Now phrenology, he claims, has a slightly better causal explanation than physiognomy, because phrenology did attempt to develop a causal relationship between the skull and the inner being. So the reasoning was something like this. So the phrenology, of course, is that you can describe features of someone's personality or characteristics by bumps and lumps and shapes of the skull. The argument here would have been that we use our brains to think and cogitate and make decisions. As we activate and use particular parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that we use all the time are going to put pressure on our skull and cause changes in the shape of our skull. The phrenologist can then measure that skull, feel those changes, and be able to work out what's happening on the inside. And the idea would then be that if someone is activating the criminal, so again, I don't know, I'm not an expert in phrenology at all, but an idea would be like, oh, if you're someone who is really, you have a tendency to be angry, you're going to use the anger center in your brain a lot, and that means like behind your ear, your right ear, there's going to be a little bump. And then sure enough, I feel that it's like, whoa, you have a problem with your anger. I can tell you've been using that part of your brain a lot. It's been pushing your skull out. That's the argument. And then that's the famous line when he says the spirit is a bone, right? So the other aspect of subconscious individuality, the aspect of its outer existence, is being quite independent and subject or qua a thing. The actuality and existence of man is his skull bone. That's how phrenology sees things. The key problem with phrenology. So it really has the same problem as physiognomy. There's just no relation, let alone a necessary relation, between the size and shape of the head and the various character traits. The two are just indifferent to each other. The phrenologist, again, can only find correlation, not causation. We'll read this section and then discuss this a bit more. So the skull of a murderer has not this organ or even sign, but this bump. But this murderer has as well a magnitude of other properties, just as he has other bumps. And along with the bumps, also hollows. One has a choice of bumps and hollows. And again, his murderous disposition can be related to any bump or hollow, and this in turn to any mental property. For the murderer is neither merely this abstraction of a murderer, nor does he have only one bump and one hollow. The observation indulged on in this point, just for that reason, sound as sensible as those of a dealer and of the housewife about rain at the annual fair and on wash day. It's the same thing as the physiognomy. Dealer and housewife might as well make the observation that it always rains when a particular neighbor goes by or when they eat roast pork. Just as rain is indifferent to circumstances like these, so too from the standpoint of observation, a particular determinateness of spirit is indifferent to a particular formation of the skull. So just finding these correlations doesn't establish the causation. But the other problem is that if you're going to say, I found this bump on this murderer and this bump on this murderer and this bump on this murderer, and look, they've all got the same bumps. It's like, yeah, that might be an interesting correlation, but you're missing everything else. What about all the differences on their skulls as well, though? So you found this really simplistic correlation, and you're not. In another part, he talks about how think of all the different things that actually all the different inner states that a person could have. And there's just an infinite variety. Like a tendency to be angry could be one, but it's also, you could say, well, a tendency to cry during sad movies, or a tendency to feel sorry for people, or a tendency to love dogs. It's like the number of inner states you could describe, just as the way that the different bumps and lumps on a head. It's like there's just so many that trying to find a pattern where they perfectly relate to each other is it's just not going to work. It's not going to be convincing. And so the same thing happens, except this one, it goes back to the boxing joke, but this one has a little bit of a twist, which I like. So when therefore a man is told, your inner being are this kind of person because your skull bone is constituted in such and such a way, this means nothing else than I regard a bone as your reality. To reply at such a judgment with a box on the ear, as in the case of a similar judgment in physiognomy mentioned above, at first takes away from the soft parts of their importance and position, and proves only that these are no true in itself, are not the reality of spirit. The retort here would, strictly speaking, have to go the length of beating in the skull of anyone making such a judgment, in order to demonstrate in a manner just as palpable as his wisdom that for a man a bone is nothing in itself, much less his true reality. So the point would be, is like, oh, why do you think I'm a bad person? Because I've got a little indent there. Okay, let's just see. And you basically beat the person in the skull till they too have that indent, and then go, look, are you a criminal now? And then, yeah, so you can actually have to hit them in such a way that you're actually helping shape their skull. And once you've done that, you go, there, have I changed who you are on the inside now that I've changed your skull? And of course, unless they're very stubborn, they'll admit that they were mistaken. Okay, but this is the important part. At the end of this section of observing reason, then, we come to the position of phrenology is, for Hegel, the point at which the difference between the way that the observing consciousness sees itself as an object and the way it is acting as a subject are so far apart that you have this really clear contradiction that the observing consciousness comes to realize. So this is the shape of the skull is the most extreme position of this when you're reducing yourself to the shape of your skull. So phrenology, by reducing itself to an object and then declaring it as found the truth, it is at once seeing itself as a for itself that expresses its freedom, and in itself, which is the most basic, simple, really simple, basic object in the world. So by this alienation, it creates for itself the possibility of a higher existence. If only it could take back again into itself its alienated object, than if it had remained undisturbed within the immediacy of being. Because spirit is all the greater the opposition from which it has returned into itself. But it creates this opposition for itself by setting aside its immediate unity and by alienating its being for self. However, if such a consciousness does not reflect on itself, the intermediate position or middle term which it occupies is an unhappy void, since what should fill and fulfill it has been turned into a fixed extreme. Thus, it has this final stage of reason in its observational role. It is its worst, and this is why its reversal becomes a necessity. So the idea here is that the observing consciousness at this point has completely alienated itself in its result. It's applied all its observing reason and come to the conclusion that all it is this skull, and that its skull determines what it is. So it's completely alienated its being from itself. And that's why if the consciousness doesn't step back and go, hang on one hand, I'm this thing that's acting in the world to find these laws that underpin everything, which is an action of consciousness trying to discover things, and an expression of freedom, an expression of the for itself. And what I've come to is a conclusion that I'm just this inert skull. And that's where that performative contradiction of observing reason becomes most apparent in phrenology. So, having hit the impasse, we now move into active reason. Having hit the impasse of seeing that observational reason ends with a contradiction between self-consciousness for itself and the external features of the individual in itself, it moves away from seeing reason as an observational activity and accepts that reason must involve acting in the world in some way. So this is section 344. The moment of that infinite judgment is the transition of immediacy into mediation or negativity. The given object is consequently determined as a negative object. Consciousness, however, is determined as self-consciousness over against it. In other words, the category which, in the course of observation, has run through the form of being is now posited in the form of being for self. Consciousness no longer aims to find itself immediately, but to produce itself in its own activity. And so reason is now going to be something that accepts, that's about its activity in the world, not about just trying to classify this world as an inert, in some sort of inert objective way. And it comes to that point because at the end of observing reason, it's reached this ultimate contradiction where on one hand, it claims to have cleverly and actively managed to wrest this knowledge of what is there from the world as a for itself. And at the same time, all it's actually discovered, though, is it's quite a, I hope I put the word there. He actually says it's like a, I don't think I did, though. No. He says it's quite a, just here it is, next thing. So he also then says that this phrenology also reveals how observing reason can be blind to the way it generates contradiction in its activity. So it's once observing, look at me, I've discovered a way to predict human behavior perfectly. And it conceals from itself the disgracefulness of the irrational crude thought, which takes the bone for the reality of self-consciousness. But it's exactly the same with the case I was talking about earlier of the book, The Case Against Reality. We have this scientist saying, look what a great, clever scientist I am. I've discovered the truth. And the truth is that evolution means that we can never see the truth. It's like on one hand, you're claiming to have actively and cleverly as like a for itself free being discovered something about the world. But the content of your discovery is that that's impossible. Your content of your discovery is that we don't seek the truth. What we seek is just survival. Therefore, everything we think and know must be wrong. So, and that's why, yes. And that's why now reason is going to go from this attempt to just observe the world and say what's there to see reason as actually something active in the world. So Hegel reminds us that real being is out there, and observing reason that reduces objects to a dead thing cannot be a true expression of reason. Observing reason ultimately, you just can't take that reality of spirit seriously, or can't, because it's not something observable or necessarily empirical or empirically observable. It can't take it into account as it's trying to develop its understanding of the world. And so next week it is the active reason and practical reason. So parts B and C of reason, and that will be the last session for a little while, and then we'll be continuing with spirit, religion, and absolute knowing. Thank you, and I'm going to stop. So we